Picture this. March 15, 1946. Rome, where the war's devastation still scars the Eternal City, and where Allied occupation authorities navigate complex relationships with Italian officials, Vatican diplomats, and intelligence networks from nations that were enemies just months ago. Captain William Ashford, a 39-year-old MI6 officer operating under diplomatic cover at the British Embassy, walks through the Vatican Quarter's narrow streets toward a meeting with a contact who claims to have information about Nazi war criminals using church networks to escape to South America. At 18:23 hours, he radios his handler at the embassy, confirming arrival in the quarter and estimating 2 hours for the meeting he's conducting at a safe house near St. Peter's Basilica. At 18:26 hours, a Vatican police officer conducting routine patrol sees Ashford enter a building on Via della Conciliazione, the boulevard connecting Rome to Vatican City. At 20:07 hours, when Ashford fails to check in as required, MI6 station chief attempts radio contact. There's no response. Search teams arriving at the safe house within 40 minutes find the door unlocked, the interior showing signs of recent occupation. But Captain Ashford has vanished. No struggle, no evidence of forced departure. Just empty rooms and documents scattered across a table, suggesting a meeting interrupted moments before investigators arrived. For 79 years, Ashford's disappearance would remain one of MI6's most troubling post-war mysteries, a case that British, Italian, American, and Vatican authorities all investigated without reaching conclusions any would publicly acknowledge. Until 2025, when restoration workers preparing a historic building near the Vatican for conversion into museum space discover a sealed vault beneath its foundations, containing equipment that predates modern intelligence technology, documents written in codes that survived digital encryption, and evidence that Captain William Ashford didn't die on that Rome evening in 1946. He discovered something that four powers had spent 79 years ensuring stayed hidden from public scrutiny and historical examination. William Ashford wasn't a typical intelligence officer. Born in 1907 to a family of Anglican clergy, he'd grown up in ecclesiastical environments, studying theology at Oxford before a crisis of faith led him toward diplomatic service instead of ordination. His knowledge of church history, Vatican politics, and religious networks made him valuable when war came, and Britain needed intelligence officers who could navigate the complex relationship between wartime necessity and Catholic institutions that claimed neutrality while maintaining influence across both Allied and Axis territories. His wartime service had been primarily in neutral countries, managing operations in Spain and Portugal where Axis and Allied intelligence services competed for influence, while officially respecting Spanish and Portuguese neutrality. He'd developed expertise in tracking how various parties used religious institutions and Vatican connections to facilitate intelligence operations, smuggle refugees, and occasionally move war criminals seeking to escape justice after Germany's inevitable defeat. His posting to Rome in December 1945 came during a critical period when the war's end had created chaos that intelligence services from multiple nations were attempting to exploit. Italy was transitioning from fascist dictatorship to uncertain democracy. The Vatican was asserting itself as moral authority and political mediator, and various intelligence networks, some governmental and some operating outside official channels, were using Rome's proximity to Vatican City to conduct operations that required the appearance of neutrality that church property could provide. Ashford's personal letters, preserved by his brother Thomas in England and donated to intelligence archives in 2017, documented his growing unease about post-war Rome. In February 1946, just weeks before his disappearance, he'd written words that Thomas would reread obsessively for decades. The war's end hasn't brought clarity to intelligence operations. If anything, it's made everything murkier. Former enemies are becoming allies, former allies are becoming competitors, and institutions like the Vatican that maintained careful neutrality during the war are now being courted by all parties as facilitators of post-war arrangements that can't be acknowledged officially. I'm investigating reports that church networks are being used to help Nazi war criminals escape to South America. But the deeper I dig, the more I suspect that multiple intelligence services, including possibly our own, are knowingly allowing these escape routes to function because they serve purposes that transcend bringing war criminals to justice. His final letter, mailed on March 14th, contained observations that would haunt investigators for 79 years. I'm meeting a contact tomorrow evening who claims to have evidence about escape networks operating through Vatican connections. The contact approached me through channels that feel too convenient, story too detailed, as if someone wants MI6 to know about these operations without making official disclosure. I'm proceeding with the meeting because intelligence value potentially justifies risks. But if something happens, if this goes wrong, tell Colonel Whitmore at headquarters that I suspected I was being positioned to discover something that multiple parties wanted discovered without taking responsibility for the disclosure. The safe house on Via della Conciliazione had been established in January 1946 as part of MI6's expanded Rome operations. The building was technically in Italian territory, just outside Vatican City's boundaries, but its proximity to St. Peter's and its history as property leased from church-affiliated organizations gave it associations that made it useful for operations involving Vatican contacts or intelligence matters requiring appearance of religious neutrality. The safe house had been used sparingly during its first 3 months of operation, primarily for meetings with Italian sources who preferred locations that suggested British intelligence respected Vatican sensitivities. Security was maintained through standard procedures, regular sweeps for listening devices, and careful screening of anyone who entered. The building had never been compromised by hostile intelligence, at least not in ways that British authorities detected. Ashford's meeting on March 15th had been arranged through a Vatican contact who'd reported that a German priest wanted to provide information about escape networks in exchange for assurances that his cooperation wouldn't be disclosed to church authorities who might view such disclosure as betrayal of clerical confidentiality. The priest, identified in M. Warnspachter 6 files only as Source Vatican 7, claimed to have detailed knowledge of which Nazi officials were being helped to escape, which church officials were facilitating the operations, and which intelligence services were aware of but not interfering with the networks. Ashford had prepared carefully for the meeting, reviewing what little intelligence MI6 possessed about post-war escape routes and coordinating with American OSS counterparts who were tracking similar operations. His radio call at 1823 hours had been routine, confirming arrival and estimated duration. Nothing in his message suggested concern or suspicion that the meeting might be anything other than standard intelligence collection. The Vatican police officer who'd seen Ashford enter the building, an Italian named Giuseppe Romano assigned to patrol the quarter, had noted the time and continued his rounds without incident. Romano's testimony, given during the investigation, described seeing a man matching Ashford's description enter the courtyard of Via della Conciliazione 47 around 1825 hours. Romano had thought nothing unusual about it, assuming the building's occupants were conducting legitimate business. At 20:07 hours, when Ashford failed to make his required check-in call, the MI6 duty officer at the embassy attempted radio contact. When that produced no response, emergency protocols were activated and a 4-person response team was dispatched to Via della Conciliazione. They arrived at 21:07 hours and found the courtyard entrance unlocked, lights visible in the second-floor apartment that served as the safe house. The apartment door was also unlocked. But when the team entered, weapons ready for potential confrontation, they found empty rooms. No Ashford. No Source Vatican 7. Just evidence of interrupted meeting, documents spread across a table, glasses suggesting drinks had been served, but no personal effects belonging to either participant. The investigation that followed consumed weeks and involved MI6, Italian police, American intelligence officers establishing operations in post-war Rome, and eventually Vatican authorities who were contacted discreetly about whether church security had detained anyone near St. Peter's on March 15th. Investigators interviewed every resident of Via della Conciliazione 47, every business owner on the street, every Vatican official who might have information. They conducted forensic examination of the safe house, searching for evidence of struggle, concealed exits, or anything explaining how two men could vanish from a secure location without being observed leaving. They found minimal conclusive evidence. The safe house showed signs of recent occupation, documents on the table relating to escape networks that appeared to be genuine intelligence materials rather than fabricated props. But no personal effects belonging to Ashford or Source Vatican VII. No indication of where they'd gone or whether departure had been voluntary or coerced. The most extensive search focused on the building's structure, examining whether hidden passages might exist connecting it to Vatican territory or to catacombs and ancient structures that honeycombed Rome's foundations. Engineers used equipment considered sophisticated for 1946, acoustic methods, and limited technological capabilities to examine walls and floors. They found nothing suggesting secret passages or concealed spaces. The official MI6 investigation concluded in May 1946 with a report acknowledging multiple possibilities without committing to any. Ashford and Source Vatican VII might have been captured by Soviet intelligence establishing presence in Rome. They might have been detained by Vatican authorities concerned about intelligence operations near church territory. They might have been killed by former Nazis protecting escape networks. Or the entire meeting might have been elaborate provocation designed to eliminate or compromise a British officer while demonstrating capabilities that would intimidate Western intelligence services. Thomas Ashford was notified that his brother was missing, presumed killed in circumstances under investigation. He spent the rest of his life searching for answers, writing to MI6 annually, hiring investigators who found nothing, eventually publishing articles in historical journals arguing that British intelligence knew more about William's fate than they'd admitted. The articles were largely ignored, dismissed as speculation from a grieving relative who couldn't accept ambiguity. For 79 years, the building on Via della Conciliazione continued serving various purposes, transitioning from intelligence safe house to private residences to eventually standing empty as property disputes delayed development plans. Finally, in 2024, Italian cultural authorities acquired it with plans to convert the historic structure into museum space, documenting post-war Rome and the complex relationships between occupation authorities, Italian society, and Vatican institutions. Restoration work began in January 2025. On February 28, contractors examining the building's foundations for structural assessment detected an anomaly using ground-penetrating radar. A section beneath the basement showed characteristics suggesting constructed void space rather than natural foundation, space that architectural records from multiple periods didn't account for. Further investigation revealed that recent construction, probably post-war, had sealed access to whatever lay beneath. The decision to investigate was made on March 10th, after consultations with British intelligence about whether the building might contain classified materials that shouldn't be disturbed. When MI6 raised no objections, contractors carefully excavated, revealing a steel door bearing British military specifications and markings indicating secure facility requiring authorized access. What lay beyond that door would finally answer questions about Captain William Ashford's disappearance and reveal why a safe house near the Vatican had mattered enough in 1946 that an MI6 officer's investigation of escape networks had resulted in his vanishing from historical record for nearly 8 decades. The steel door opened into a vault that British military engineers had constructed in late 1945, carved from the building's foundations with precision that suggested urgent but careful work. The vault was approximately 15 meters long and 10 meters wide, its walls lined with metal shelving containing filing boxes, document cases, and sealed containers bearing both British and Vatican markings. Italian and British investigation teams descended into a space that architectural records insisted couldn't exist, finding evidence of arrangements between intelligence services and religious institutions that neither had ever publicly acknowledged. The vault's organization suggested it had served dual purposes. One section contained standard intelligence materials, files, and reports documenting MI6 operations in post-war Italy. But another section held materials that were far more sensitive, documents bearing Vatican seals, papal diplomatic correspondence, and records of conversations between church officials and intelligence officers from multiple nations about arrangements that served both spiritual and secular purposes in ways that public disclosure would have made politically impossible. The investigation team's first discovery was a desk positioned near the vault's entrance, containing a journal bearing William Ashford's name and service number. The journal began on March 15, 1946, at 18:28 hours, just minutes after Ashford had entered the safe house to meet Source Vatican VII. Meeting commenced as arranged. Source revealed himself as Father Heinrich Müller, German priest who served as liaison between Vatican and German intelligence during final war years. He's brought documentation of escape networks being facilitated by church officials, but also something far more significant: evidence of an arrangement between Vatican, British, American, and even Soviet intelligence regarding preservation of religious and cultural materials threatened by war and post-war political instability. The subsequent entries documented what happened during that meeting, revelations that explained everything about Ashford's disappearance. 1947 hours. Father Müller has taken me to a vault beneath the safe house that MI6 didn't know existed. The Vatican apparently negotiated access to this space in 1945, using it to store materials that church officials wanted protected but couldn't safely keep within Vatican territory where political pressures might force their disclosure or seizure. What I'm seeing challenges every assumption I had about relationships between intelligence services and religious institutions. Ashford's journal revealed his discovery of what Father Müller called the Concordia Archive, a collection of documents and artifacts that the Vatican had been assembling since 1939 when war's outbreak made clear that European civilization faced threats that transcended political boundaries. The archive contained religious texts that Germans had seized from occupied territories, art and manuscripts that Nazis had confiscated from Jewish families and institutions, diplomatic correspondence documenting Vatican efforts to mediate conflicts and protect civilians, and most controversially, intelligence reports from German, Italian, British, American, and Soviet sources that church officials had received from all parties during the war. But Ashford's journal also documented his growing understanding that the archive represented something unprecedented. March 16, 02:15 hours. I've spent 8 hours examining materials in this vault. Father Müller explains that the Vatican began this collection believing that if civilization destroyed itself, the Church had a responsibility to preserve evidence of what had existed and what had been lost. But the collection evolved into something more. A repository where intelligence services from nations at war with each other could deposit materials they wanted, preserved without any single nation controlling access. The journal revealed that intelligence officers from multiple nations had been coordinating with Vatican officials throughout the war, using church neutrality as cover for arrangements that served collective interests despite political impossibility of official cooperation. Documents in the archive documented German intelligence sharing information about Soviet military capabilities with Western services through Vatican intermediaries. British intelligence providing warnings to German officers about SS atrocities that even Wehrmacht leaders found excessive. American intelligence coordinating with Soviet counterparts on issues where mutual interests outweighed ideological conflicts, all facilitated by Vatican officials who maintained plausible deniability about their role. Ashford had been given the same choice that other intelligence officers had faced when they discovered Concordia arrangements: leave, report finding materials of limited significance, and return to normal duties, or remain as British observer, understanding the archive's purpose and ensuring materials being preserved, didn't threaten UK security while serving as liaison with MI6 handlers who'd be contacted through channels that protected both Crown and Church from complications if the arrangement became known. Ashford's internal struggle with this decision was documented over 3 days spent in the vault. March 17, 16:23 hours. Father Muller has given me until tomorrow to decide. He's explained that the archive operates with tacit approval from intelligence chiefs and Vatican leadership, all recognizing that preserving certain materials serves purposes that official channels can't accommodate because political considerations always compromise purely historical or moral objectives. The archive fills that gap, collecting materials from sources that wouldn't normally cooperate, and occasionally preventing disasters that might result from one party acting without knowledge of what others know. The journal documented specific examples Father Muller had shown Ashford of the archive's value. Intelligence about Nazi atrocities that had been shared with Allied services before those atrocities became public knowledge, allowing preparations for war crimes tribunals. Information about Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe that had been provided to Western services before Yalta Conference, enabling more informed negotiations. And evidence of British and American intelligence operations that had been passed to Vatican officials who could mediate when those operations threatened to violate church principles or endanger civilians under church protection. Ashford's decision, documented in an entry dated March 18, 1946, explained why he'd never emerged from the safe house. I'm staying. Not because I've been coerced or because I no longer value British interests. Because I believe preserving historical truth and preventing knowledge destruction serves Britain's interests, even if it requires accepting that the Vatican plays a role in intelligence operations that official histories will never acknowledge. I'll serve as British observer, monitoring the archive to ensure materials being preserved don't compromise UK operations while it continues collecting evidence that will benefit historians and serve moral accountability long after current political conflicts have been forgotten. The investigation team found extensive evidence that Ashford had indeed remained in Rome after his reported disappearance. A second journal, covering the period from 1946 to 1955, revealed that Ashford had lived in Vatican City under ecclesiastical cover as Brother William, a British convert to Catholicism serving as archivist and translator for Vatican libraries. The arrangement had been extraordinarily complex, requiring Ashford to maintain his religious cover while communicating with MI6 handlers through channels so convoluted that even decades later investigators struggled to understand how information had been transmitted without Italian or Soviet intelligence detecting British operations literally inside Vatican walls. This second journal painted a detailed picture of Ashford's life as observer during the early Cold War. Working in Vatican libraries, cataloging medieval manuscripts while actually monitoring Concordia archive materials, attending Mass, and participating in monastic life while serving as intelligence officer, ensuring British interests weren't compromised by materials being preserved. Communicating with MI6 through confession booths, encrypted letters disguised as theological correspondence, and occasionally meetings with handlers disguised as visiting clergy. And wrestling constantly with contradictions between his public piety and his actual role as intelligence operative using church sanctuary for purposes that served Crown more than Christ. The journal documented several crises where Ashford's observer role had been crucial. In 1947, when Soviet intelligence attempted to infiltrate Vatican archives seeking intelligence about Western operations, Ashford had coordinated with American and French observers to identify the infiltrators before they could access Concordia materials. In 1948, when communist forces took control of Czechoslovakia and began persecuting church officials, Ashford had helped arrange evacuations using intelligence networks that operated through Vatican connections. In 1950, when MI6 planned an operation in Rome that would have exposed Vatican intelligence cooperation to Italian communists, Ashford had convinced his handlers to modify the operation. And in 1953, When Stalin's death created uncertainty about Soviet intentions, Ashford had participated in back-channel communications through Vatican intermediaries that helped prevent misunderstandings from escalating into crises. But the journal also documented immense personal costs: complete isolation from family and friends, inability to maintain relationships outside Vatican walls because his cover required total commitment to monastic life, growing awareness that his brother Thomas was searching for answers about his disappearance while he lived literally blocks away, unable to make contact. The entries from early 1950s showed a man wrestling with depression, questioning whether preserving intelligence materials and facilitating Vatican diplomacy justified abandoning the identity and relationships that had defined his life before March 1946. The crisis point came in 1954, documented in entries revealing Ashford had requested release from observer duty. September 12, 1954. I've been Brother William for 8 years. 8 years of pretending devotion I don't feel while serving purposes I increasingly question. Father Muller argues that the archive prevents knowledge destruction and that my role ensures British interests are protected. But I'm convinced that living a lie, however noble the purposes it serves, corrupts everything, including the principles we claim to protect. The journal revealed that the Vatican and MI6 had agreed to Ashford's release with conditions reflecting both parties' concerns. He'd be given new identity, relocated to a country with minimal Vatican and MI6 presence, and provided with support allowing him to live quietly. He'd maintain contact with both church and intelligence handlers throughout his life, available for consultation when his unique expertise was needed, but he'd no longer serve as active observer inside Vatican walls. Ashford's final journal entry as Brother William was dated February 7, 1955. Tomorrow I leave Rome. I'll become Charles Morrison, Australian academic who emigrated after teaching in post-war Europe. The identity is constructed carefully enough to withstand investigation. Documentation showing me teaching at universities that were too disorganized during occupation to maintain perfect records. I'll live in Melbourne, teach church history if position can be arranged, and try to build life from fragments of identities I've abandoned. Thomas will never know I survived. My colleagues in Vatican libraries will never learn Brother William was British intelligence. And I'll spend remaining years wondering if preserving medieval manuscripts and intelligence cooperation justified the lies I told, including lies I told to myself about serving higher purposes. The investigation team found documentation of Ashford's reintegration in files that both Vatican and MI6 successors had maintained. He'd lived in Melbourne under his assumed identity from 1955 until his death in 1987 at age 80. He'd taught church history at the University of Melbourne, published several respected books on Vatican diplomacy and religious institutions during wartime, and maintained low profile despite insights into matters that few outside classified circles understood. He'd never married, never formed close relationships requiring explanation of gaps in his history, and never revealed his actual identity even to colleagues who became friends. He'd maintained contact with both Vatican and MI6 handlers throughout his life, providing consultation on religious and intelligence matters when his expertise was needed. And significantly, he'd written a memoir in his final year, intended for eventual release, explaining what the Concordia archive had been and why he'd believed serving it was worth sacrificing everything. That memoir, discovered among documents in the vault, provided the most comprehensive explanation of Vatican intelligence cooperation that investigators had ever seen. Ashford argued that the Church's spiritual mission required protecting knowledge and preserving truth, even when political pressures made such protection complicated. The Concordia Archive had been the Vatican's attempt to ensure that evidence of wartime events survived regardless of which political systems emerged afterward, and that intelligence services from multiple nations had recognized that allowing church officials to maintain such archives served all parties' interests, even if official cooperation was politically impossible. He acknowledged moral complications, arguments that could be made that he'd betrayed his oath by joining an arrangement that served Vatican purposes as much as British interests, but he also argued that preserving historical truth ultimately served all nations, including Britain. That narrow intelligence advantage meant nothing if the price was losing evidence that future generations would need for understanding how civilization had nearly destroyed itself and what arrangements had prevented total collapse. The Italian government's response to the vault's discovery mirrored patterns from previous revelations. The site was classified at highest security levels, contents were cataloged under protocols ensuring minimal access, and diplomatic consultations were held with British, American, Vatican, and other governments about handling evidence of arrangements none had publicly acknowledged. Eventually, consensus emerged that the vault would be described as intelligent storage from post-war period, now of historical interest only, and that truth about Concordia Archive and Ashford's fate would remain classified indefinitely. But Ashford's family was contacted. Given partial information, authorities determined was deserved and safe. In May 2025, Thomas Ashford's grandson, Peter, received notification from MI6. Captain Ashford had disappeared in 1946, but not through capture or accident. He'd discovered a classified facility, had remained to serve as observer under circumstances requiring his official death, and had lived until 1987 under assumed identity in Australia. Peter was given access to some of Ashford's letters, written to Thomas but never sent, documenting his life as Charles Morrison and his enduring connection to family he'd abandoned. He was shown portions of Ashford's memoir, explaining his choices and principles he'd believed justified sacrificing personal identity. And he was told, in carefully crafted language, that his great-uncle had served purposes transcending his military oath, that his sacrifice had contributed to preserving materials benefiting all nations, and that he'd never stopped regretting pain his disappearance had caused. The building on Via della Conciliazione was converted to museum space as planned, though the vault was sealed before public access was granted. A small plaque near the entrance acknowledged that British intelligence officer William Ashford had disappeared at this location in 1946, giving his life in service to ideals that authorities still considered too sensitive to fully explain. But among those few who knew complete truth, who'd read Ashford's journals and understood what Concordia Archive represented, there was acknowledgement that post-war intelligence history was more complex than public narratives suggested, that some officers had served purposes transcending national intelligence, that preserving truth had sometimes required arrangements between institutions that officially couldn't cooperate. And that line between serving national interests and serving historical truth had been contested in ways that simple classifications of loyalty and betrayal couldn't capture. Captain William Ashford had walked through a safe house door on March 15, 1946, and vanished into a world where intelligence service transcended national borders and involved cooperation with religious institutions, serving moral purposes that secular governments couldn't officially acknowledge. He'd spent 9 years in Vatican City and 32 years in Australia, carrying secrets that would remain buried for 79 years before being partially revealed to descendants who struggled to understand why their relative had chosen historical truth over family, principles over personal identity, and exile over recognition for service that official histories would never acknowledge. The secrets revealed in Rome's Vatican Quarter weren't crimes but compromises. Not betrayals, but sacrifices made by individuals who believed that preserving historical truth required commitments that conventional loyalty couldn't accommodate. Whether those commitments were justified, whether Ashford's choice to serve the Concordia Archive was ethical, those remained questions without simple answers. But for Peter Ashford and others who learned their relatives' fates, there was at least understanding that disappearance had meant something beyond death, that sacrifice had served purposes transcending individual nations even if those purposes remained controversial, and that sometimes greatest service involved giving up everything, including name, family, and recognition, to protect truth that no nation owned but all humanity needed, preserved for understanding how civilization had survived its darkest period and what arrangements between unlikely allies had made that survival possible. This story was intense. But this one on the right is even more insane. You won't believe what they uncovered.